Hi everybody, welcome to the lecture on 1990s rock and roll. We're going to come out of the 80s in the year 1992. That's going to be an important year because a lot of things are going to change all at once. People are going to begin to burn out on this glam metal idea, this very commercialized rock style, and they're going to start to look towards alternative and edgier and more personal, less commercialized, less produced music. The demonstration of the interest in that sort of sound and style was probably best encapsulated in Metallica's self-titled album, Metallica in 1991. Metallica had been a fringe band through most of the 80s, didn't get a lot of airplay, was considered heavy metal. It was considered very heavy metal. In 1991 was sort of their ability. 1991 demonstrated an interest in heavy metal being more than a fringe genre. It started to become more mainstream, and that led into the explosion that started in 1992. We're going to start the decade of the 90s in the year 1992, and the decade will go, we'll say, to about 2000. What's happening in the world in 1992? Well, fortunately, nothing terrible. In fact, the 80s and 90s, and even 2000s that we look at today, were periods of relative calm throughout the world. In 1992, Bill Clinton is going to be elected president. He is the first Democratic president that we'll have for 2 terms since the early 1960s. Carter had been elected in the 70s after the Watergate scandal had tainted the Nixon-Ford administration. We have the first World Trade Center bombing happening in 1993. This is not the big bombing that happens in 2001. This is not 9/11, but it's sort of a precursor to that terrorism starts to come home to the United States. The biggest thing happening at the beginning of the decade is Desert Storm, which is the first invasion of Iraq under the first George Bush. And we have the Rodney King riots, which were in 1992. Those riots were a result of police being found not guilty of abusing a black man in Los Angeles. Pretty much anyone who saw the video disagreed with that. We also had the O.J. Simpson slow speed chase happening about that time. And as we look through here at the timeline of the 20th century, no major wars. Desert Storm is going on, but it's not affecting the day-to-day life of most people. Most people are watching it on TV. We don't see many huge revolutions happening that the United States is involved in. It's a period of relative calm. The decade will end in the year 2000, 2001, somewhere in there, and we'll go ahead and put 9/11 as sort of the world event that is going to draw to close that decade. And after 9/11, we will engage in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Technologically speaking, some very important things are happening. One is we really get the emergence of the personal computer as being important in the development of music. Now, the PC had been around in the 80s, came out in the late 70s and popularized in the mid-80s, but it wasn't powerful enough to do music. We had done some kind of programming on it with synthesizers and samplers. We weren't at the point where studios could record music into a computer and begin to edit it. In the mid to early 90s, it was probably $15,000 to $20,000 to buy one of these computers, but by the year 2000, it becomes pretty normal for most people to be able to afford a computer that can record and edit and mix music on. This is a major development in all forms of music. The other major technology innovation that emerges is the internet, and the internet won't have a large impact on music until about the year 2000 when Napster comes out. So I'll go ahead and write Napster over here. Of all the technologies that have emerged, Napster is probably going to have the biggest impact on the industry. Napster is also going to be responsible for breaking down rock and roll, because the way that rock and roll had been marketed, commercialized, and the way that people listened to rock and roll was developed before the internet. And rock and roll doesn't transition well to the internet. Hip-hop does a much better job, probably because of its embrace of earlier technologies, such as the synthesizers and samplers, in a way that rock and roll didn't. So what happens here in the 90s before we get to Napster? Let's take a look at some of the bands. In 1992, glam metal is going to disappear. And it's going to disappear with the appearance of grunge music, most specifically the band Nirvana. What is grunge? Grunge is a combination of heavy metal, alternative, and punk. There had been an underground punk scene going in the 80s, though few people heard it, but it really appealed to the musicians of the Pacific Northwest who brought about the grunge music. When we listen to grunge music, we're going to hear slow, trudgy, very guitar-heavy music, and then we're going to have kind of the self-reflective attitudes that we had heard a little bit in the alternative music of The Cure, and then we're going to have the rambunctious rebelliousness of punk. Who are these bands in grunge? Well, Nirvana is one that probably most of us are familiar with. So we have Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. And these are the 4 primary grunge bands. They all come from the Seattle area, which I'm partially attached to because I was living there and I was probably most of your age right when this grunge scene was happening. It was pretty exciting. These are the 4 godfathers of grunge, and from here on out, a large portion of rock and roll is going to try to emulate and sound like what these 4 bands sound like. The last number 1 rock song will be in the year 2002, and that song sounds very similar to these grunge songs. So this will be about a 10-year run this sound has. The genre that'll come after, they start to call post-grunge. Grunge doesn't last that long because Kurt Cobain kills himself in 94. It moves into a thing called post-grunge, but really, post-grunge and grunge, as we listen through some of this music, are very, very similar sounds. Now from that grunge sound, we're going to get a more alternative pop-punk sound. And pop-punk's going to emerge on the scene just slightly after grunge, maybe a year and a half. It's going to be influenced a lot by Nirvana. The big bands we'll know in that genre are Green Day and Sublime, and I'd like you to be familiar with them. There was an explosion in the singer-songwriter genre, which was interesting. We hadn't seen that really since the 1960s. And what do we mean by singer-songwriter? Usually it's one person with their guitar writing the song, and then a band plays around them. And we're going to have a lot of influence from female musicians at the time in the singer-songwriter genre. I'm just going to write it over here so we have room. Singer-songwriter. And the 2 artists that I'd like you to know from there are Sheryl Crow and Alanis Morissette. There's going to be a revival in the idea of a jam band that will start to happen too. And the biggest band that we'll know from there is Phish. And these jam bands are going to emulate the Grateful Dead. And in fact, Grateful Dead disbands in the mid-90s when Jerry Garcia dies and bands like Phish take over, and now people are Phish heads. They follow around Phish. There's also the emergence on a heavier side of industrial metal. Industrial metal is metal that is edgier than traditional metal had been. Metallica really gave birth to this genre, and grunge really gave it popularity. Bands that I'd like you to know from that area are System of a Down. And then early on, we had 9 Inch Nails. And 9 Inch Nails actually was, some of their songs were in the 80s, but they didn't really become popular and well-known until the 90s. Again, after Nirvana made it okay to be an alternative band. The last band I have on here is Limp Biskit. And they're on there because you start to have rap rock. We start to introduce the idea of integrating rap, hip-hop styles, and rock styles together. As we look at this, it looks like there's a lot more genres than there were in the 80s. Remember, in the 80s, we only had kind of basically 4 rock genres: metal, glam metal, pop rock, and alternative. And here it looks like we have a lot more. And in a lot of ways we do, because we are going to see the reemergence in 1992 of the small record label. And everything in 1992 is going to be about rebellion. The only period of time when rock and roll rebelled more than in 1992 was in 1967. These artists are the artists of Gen X. That is my generation, the generation that's between the baby boomers and the millennials. These are the children of the older baby boomers who are just turning 20 and going to college right about this time in 1992, and they are burnt out on the glam metal sound, and they want anything that will sound different than that. And so this music is going to rebel against pretty much everything that was going on in the 80s, from the clothing to the attitudes to the sound of the music and to the perspective. We're going to have a couple firsts that we haven't heard before in 90s music. And by first, I don't mean that we've never heard it, but we've never heard it in this way before. We're going to hear anger for the first time, very strongly in rock and roll. There had been a precursor to this in the hip-hop movement when NWA came out with hardcore gangster rap. Many of the white audiences that had been listening to glam metal felt a connection with that. And so when grunge music comes out with that sense of anger and rage, it's adapted very widely and becomes part of the 1990s sound. Second, we're going to start to really get the idea of self-loathing. We had heard a little bit of this or seen a little bit of this when we saw the Cure video last week. The idea that I don't want to be a rock star, I don't like... the idea that maybe I'm not so popular and I'm not so great. Where those glam metal bands were all about being showy, this idea of the self-loathing is going to be about turning inward and being the geek and being nerdy and being the geek and not being popular. And we'll start to hear songs like Loser by Beck. Half the artists that we listen to will have the word suicide somewhere in their song, or I'm no good and I hate myself. Almost all of these bands that I highlighted there are going to have a love-hate relationship with popularity. In fact, in some of them it'll be hate. Many of them can't handle the popularity and die. The idea of being alternative is that it is inherently anti-commercial. And so punk stayed true to its roots by never making it big and those artists never making lots of money. But these artists in the 90s are going to start to make a lot of money by being anti-commercial. In being anti-commercial, it is also more personal. We expect the artists to be singing about their personal experience, as opposed to the 80s when they were singing about kind of generalistic experiences of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And lastly, tied in with that personal and that self-loathing is going to be introspective. This music is not going to be about changing the world, it's going to be about rejecting the world. Part of this is that the baby boomer generation was so big, so in the 1967 the idea was summer of love, let's change the world. Gen Xers is such a small generation, they're like, well, we can't change the world anyway, so screw it, we don't want to be part of it. And it was a rejection of the hippie, yuppie sentiments where the world was changing, and this saying that, your world isn't so great, we don't really want to be part of it.